How can a single word added to a prayer cleave an empire and create two separate worlds? And more curiously, how could a letter forged in the 8th century to grant the Pope of Rome supreme power over all kings and patriarchs become the legal bedrock for this division 300 years later? The story of the Great Schism is not a story of one event in the year 1054. It is the story of a slow, creeping separation, a family drama played out over 1,000 years where two brothers born of the same Roman mother grew up speaking different languages, living in different houses, and eventually, looking at the same sky, saw a different God. It began not with an argument but with a decision, a choice made by one man that would echo through eternity. In the year 330, the Emperor Constantine, master of the world, turned his back on the city of Rome. He founded a new capital on the shores of the Bosphorus, a city he immodestly named after himself, Constantinople. In doing so, he created two orphans. Old Rome, the heart of the empire for a millennium, was left without its emperor, a fading relic on the Tiber. New Rome, Constantinople, was born without apostolic heritage, a brilliant upstart lacking the hallowed graves of Peter and Paul. This geographic separation was the first crack in the monolithic Christian world. In the West, as the empire crumbled under the relentless waves of barbarian invasions, the Bishop of Rome, the Pope, became the sole figure of stability. He negotiated with Attila the Hun. He organized the city's defenses. He became a temporal ruler by necessity, a spiritual father who also had to be a political strongman. His authority grew not from imperial decree, but from the dust and chaos of a fallen world. In the East, the opposite was true. The Roman Empire did not fall, it simply continued, speaking Greek. The emperor in Constantinople was the absolute ruler, God's regent on earth. The patriarch was his chief spiritual advisor, a vital part of the imperial machine, but a part nonetheless. He was appointed and could be dismissed by the emperor. In the West, the church was slowly becoming a state. In the East, the church was a department of the state. This fundamental difference in the experience of power shaped two profoundly different mentalities. The West, forged in anarchy, craved order and centralized authority. The East, living in unbroken imperial tradition, valued consensus and symphony. Rome demanded obedience. Constantinople expected harmony. The language barrier only widened the chasm. In the West, Latin was the language of law, theology, and administration. In the East, Greek was the tongue of philosophy, poetry, and the original Gospels. Soon, theologians in one half of the empire could no longer read the works of the other in the original. They relied on translations, often poor, sometimes deliberately misleading. Nuances were lost. Subtleties of thought became rigid points of dogma. What a Greek philosopher saw as a mystical paradox, a Roman lawyer interpreted as a contractual loophole. They were using the same vocabulary of faith, Trinity, incarnation, grace, but the words meant different things. It was a dialogue of the deaf, conducted across a growing sea of incomprehension. They both believed in one Christ, but they were painting his portrait with entirely different cultural brushes. Have you ever tried to explain a dream to someone who doesn't understand your language? Now imagine that dream is the very nature of God. These simmering tensions erupted in a series of fierce theological battles that were, in reality, wars of cultural identity. The Arian controversy in the 4th century, which questioned the full divinity of Christ, was settled at the Council of Nicaea. But while the West largely accepted the decision and moved on, the debate raged in the East for decades, becoming entangled in imperial politics. Later, the iconoclast controversy of the 8th and 9th centuries was even more revealing. The Byzantine emperors, fearing idolatry, ordered the destruction of all religious images. For over a century, the Eastern Church was torn apart by a violent state-sponsored campaign against icons. The popes in Rome vehemently opposed this, defending the use of images as windows to the divine. This was not just a dispute about art. For the East, it was about the emperor's right to define religious practice. For the West, it was about the Church's freedom from state control. Each crisis, each council, each dispute left behind a residue of suspicion. Each side began to compile a list of grievances, a mental dossier of the other's errors and heresies. The West saw the East as prone to esoteric philosophical hair-splitting, subservient to a despotic emperor who meddled in church affairs. They viewed the Greeks as effeminate, treacherous, and arrogant, obsessed with court intrigue, while barbarians were at the gates. The East saw the West as a land of uncultured, violent barbarians, governed by an increasingly audacious bishop who was making unprecedented claims to universal power. They viewed the Latins as legalistic, rigid, and ignorant of the subtle depths of theology. Rome learned to survive in a world without an emperor. Constantinople forgot how to live with a god who wasn't one. The tragedy was that for centuries they still believed they were one church. They were like a married couple living in separate houses, communicating through angry letters, each convinced they were the sole defender of the family's honor, unaware that the divorce was already happening in their hearts. The formal separation was still centuries away, but the spiritual schism was already a reality, a ghost haunting the house of a once united faith. What do you believe is a greater cause of division, a genuine disagreement over principles, or the personal ambition of leaders who use those principles for their own gain? Let us know your thoughts in the comments. This growing ambition found its perfect opportunity not in a theological treatise, but on a cold Christmas day in the year 800. In the Basilica of St. Peter in Rome, Pope Leo III placed a golden crown on the head of a towering, illiterate Frankish king named Charles, known to history as Charlemagne, and proclaimed him Emperor of the Romans. For the Pope, this was a desperate act of self-preservation, seeking a protector against his enemies in Italy and a counterweight to the distant, indifferent emperor in Constantinople. For Charlemagne, it was the legitimization of his vast conquests. For the Western world, it was the birth of a new empire, a revival of Roman glory in a Germanic body. But for Constantinople, this act was an outrage, a betrayal, a political earthquake. In their eyes, there was only one Roman emperor, the one who sat on the throne in their city. This barbarian king was a usurper, and the pope who crowned him was a kingmaker, a rebel who had arrogated to himself a power that belonged to God and the true emperor alone. The coronation shattered the myth of a single, universal Christian empire. From this moment on, there were two emperors, two empires, and two rival claims to the legacy of Rome. Almost simultaneously, a theological bomb assembled centuries earlier in a remote corner of the West began to tick. In 6th century Spain, the Visigothic kings had been Arian Christians. To combat this heresy and emphasize the full divinity of the Son, the local church had added a single word to the Nicene Creed, the universal statement of Christian faith. The creed stated that the Holy Spirit proceeds from the Father. The Spanish version added "and from the Son." In Latin, this was the infamous Filioque. It was a local addition, a theological buttress for a specific problem, but this seemingly innocuous phrase traveled from Spain to the court of Charlemagne. The Frankish theologians, eager to assert their intellectual independence from the Greeks, embraced it. For them, it was a logical clarification. If the Son is equal to the Father, then the Spirit must proceed from them both. They saw it as a defense of the Trinity's unity. But when news of this addition reached the East, it was met with horror. The creed had been established by the great ecumenical councils, the gatherings of the entire church. To alter it unilaterally was a violation of the highest authority. For the Greeks, the Filioque was not just an illegal addition, it was a profound heresy. It upset the delicate balance of the Trinity, demoting the Father from his unique position as the sole source of divinity and subordinating the Holy Spirit. To them, the Latin formula suggested two sources in the Godhead, a theological monstrosity. It was more than a quibble over a preposition. It was a clash of two different ways of understanding God. The Latin mind, practical and legalistic, thought in terms of relations and order. The Greek mind, mystical and philosophical, thought in terms of origins and essence. What the West saw as a logical deduction, the East saw as a metaphysical catastrophe. A creed is a fortress of faith, but add one stone without permission, and it becomes a prison for unity. The political schism now had a theological banner. The two rival empires now had two slightly different creeds. The stage was set for the first open confrontation, a dress rehearsal for the final break. This confrontation erupted in the middle of the 9th century, a clash of two brilliant, powerful, and utterly uncompromising men, Pope Nicholas I in Rome and Patriarch Photius the Great in Constantinople. Nicholas was an aristocrat, a man of iron will who held the most exalted view of papal power yet seen. He believed the Pope was the supreme judge of the entire Church, East and West, with the authority to intervene in any diocese and depose any bishop, including the Patriarch of Constantinople. Photius was arguably the most learned man of his age, a scholar of encyclopedic knowledge, a brilliant diplomat who had been a layman and imperial secretary before being rapidly promoted to the patriarchal throne. The conflict began over a messy internal affair in Constantinople, but Nicholas saw his chance to assert Roman authority. He sent legates to Constantinople, not to investigate, but to pass judgment. Photius, a master of canon law and diplomacy, outmaneuvered them completely. The dispute escalated. Nicholas condemned Photius. Photius, in turn, convened a council in Constantinople in the year 867. This council not only condemned the Pope for his interference, but, for the first time, formally condemned the Filioque as a heresy and excommunicated Pope Nicholas. The anathemas flew between the two capitals like poisoned darts. For a few years, the Church was in open schism. Photius wrote a brilliant, scathing critique of Latin errors, from the Filioque to clerical celibacy and the use of unleavened bread in the Eucharist. Nicholas responded with thunderous letters asserting his universal jurisdiction, based in part on the aforementioned forged document known as the Donation of Constantine, which purported to show that the first Christian emperor had granted the Pope's authority over the entire Western world. It was a war of documents, insults, and excommunications. In the end, a series of political upheavals in Constantinople led to Photius's temporary deposition, and a fragile peace was patched up. The mutual excommunications were rescinded, but the damage was done. The Photian Schism, as it came to be known, had laid bare the two irreconcilable positions. Rome had explicitly claimed absolute monarchical power over the entire Church. Constantinople had explicitly rejected that claim and had condemned a core Latin theological doctrine as heresy. They had stepped back from the abyss, but not before they both had a long, hard look into it. The seeds of mistrust had been sown, and in the heart of Rome, those seeds were about to be watered by a revolution. This fragile peace held for over a century, but it was the peace of a dormant volcano. Beneath the surface, the Western world was changing in ways that made the final eruption inevitable. The Papacy, after the strong leadership of men like Nicholas I, plunged into one of the darkest periods in its history. The 10th century became known as the Saeculum Obscurum, the Dark Age, or the Pornocracy. The papal throne became the plaything of powerful Roman aristocratic families. Popes were installed and deposed at will. Some were murdered. One was put on trial after his death, his rotting corpse propped up in the courtroom. It was an era of profound corruption and humiliation. For observers in the glittering civilized city of Constantinople, this was proof of the West's barbarism. The See of Peter, which claimed to be the head of the world, could not even govern its own city. This Roman degradation, however, paradoxically contained the seeds of its own recovery, and with it, a new and far more dangerous vision of papal power. Out of the chaos and corruption, a powerful reform movement was born, originating in the Benedictine monastery of Cluny in France. It was a grassroots call for a return to spiritual purity, a fight against the twin evils that plagued the Western Church: simony, the buying and selling of church offices, and clerical marriage, which was seen as a source of corruption and the secularization of the clergy. This movement for moral reform soon became a movement for political liberation. The reformers realized that to cleanse the church, they first had to free it from the control of secular kings and emperors, who appointed their own bishops and abbots. The target of this new movement became the Holy Roman Emperor in Germany, who routinely descended into Italy to install his preferred candidate on the papal throne. The cry for freedom of the church became a rallying cry for a revolution, and the papacy itself became the headquarters of this revolution. The turning point came in the mid-11th century with the arrival of a series of reform-minded popes, most notably Leo IX and the man who would become Gregory VII. These men were not just interested in moral purity, they had a radical new vision for the church and the world. They believed that the source of all the church's problems was lay interference. The solution, therefore, was to create a new order, a spiritual monarchy with the Pope as its absolute sovereign. The Pope, they argued, was not merely the successor of Peter, the first among equals, as the East believed. He was the vicar of Christ on earth, the source of all authority, spiritual and temporal. To cleanse the house of God, the reformers built a throne higher than any king's, forgetting that from such a height, all brothers look like subjects. This new theory of papal power was a declaration of war on the old order of Christendom. This revolutionary ideology found its most stark expression in a document called the Dictatus Papae, the Dictates of the Pope, associated with Pope Gregory VII. Its 27 theses were breathtaking in their audacity. That the Roman pontiff alone can with right be called universal. That he alone can depose or reinstate bishops. That he himself may be judged by no one, and most explosively of all, that he may depose emperors. This was not a claim to spiritual leadership, it was a claim to total world domination. The Church was no longer a spiritual communion in a Christian empire, it was a transnational corporation with a divinely appointed chief executive officer, an international government with the Pope as its supreme king. This new, militant and centralized Rome, hardened in its titanic struggle for power with the German emperors, now turned its gaze eastward. It no longer saw the ancient patriarchates of Constantinople, Alexandria, Antioch, and Jerusalem as sister churches. It saw them as rebellious provinces that needed to be brought into line under the absolute authority of the Roman pontiff. The geopolitical fuse for this impending explosion was lit in southern Italy. For centuries, this region had been a Byzantine province, a bastion of Greek culture and Orthodox Christianity. But in the 11th century, a new force arrived, the Normans. These fierce warriors, descendants of the Vikings, began to conquer southern Italy for themselves. At first, they were enemies of the papacy. But in a brilliant diplomatic move, Pope Leo IX made a deal. He recognized the Norman conquests, and in return, the Normans became his vassals and allies. For the first time, the Pope had a powerful, independent military force at his disposal. The Normans systematically drove the Byzantines out of Italy and replaced Greek bishops with Latin ones, enforcing Roman customs. This was not just a political conquest, it was a spiritual one. The border between the Latin and Greek worlds was shifting, and it was shifting through force of arms. The last peaceful point of contact between the two churches in Italy was being erased, replaced by a hostile military frontier. A reformed revolutionary papacy, armed with a new theory of absolute power and backed by Norman swords, was now on a collision course with a proud and ancient empire that recognized no master but its own emperor. The year was 1053, the catastrophe was 1 year away. The final act began not as a declaration of war but as a diplomatic mission. The Byzantine emperor, Constantine IX Monomachus, faced a dual threat. The Normans were pressing from the west, and the Seljuk Turks were advancing from the east. He needed an alliance, and the most logical partner was the Pope, who also saw the Normans as a problem. The emperor sent a letter to Pope Leo IX, filled with friendly overtures, hoping to forge a military and political pact. The Pope, seeing an opportunity to assert his authority, dispatched a delegation to Constantinople to negotiate the terms. but he chose the worst possible man to lead this mission: Cardinal Humbert of Silva Candida. Humbert was a brilliant canon lawyer, a fiery and zealous reformer, and one of the chief architects of the new papal ideology. He was also arrogant, inflexible, and possessed a deep-seated contempt for the Greeks, whom he considered effeminate schismatics. He was not coming to negotiate, he was coming to demand submission. In Constantinople, Humbert and his fellow legates were met by an equally formidable and proud opponent, Patriarch Michael Cerularius. Like Humbert, Cerularius was a politician in clerical robes, ambitious, powerful, and deeply suspicious of the Latins. He had risen through the ranks of the civil service before becoming patriarch and viewed the Pope's claims to universal jurisdiction as a monstrous absurdity. He saw the recent Norman campaign of Latinization in southern Italy as a direct attack on his authority and a sign of Rome's aggressive intentions. When the papal legates arrived in the spring of 1054, the stage was set not for a reconciliation, but for a clash of two immovable objects. The emperor, desperate for his alliance, treated the legates with great honor, but Cerularius gave them the cold shoulder. He questioned the validity of their credentials, noting that Pope Leo had died while they were en route, and refused to meet with them directly. To him, they were not ambassadors from a sister church, but agents of a foreign power with heretical beliefs. What followed was not a theological debate, but a dialogue of escalating insults. Humbert, infuriated by the patriarch's snub, published a furious diatribe against the Greek church, accusing it of a laundry list of heresies, from allowing priests to marry to, bizarrely, omitting a word from the creed, a reference to the Filioque, which the Greeks, of course, had never added in the first place. Cerularius responded by commissioning a rebuttal that condemned Latin customs, particularly the use of unleavened bread, or azymes, for the Eucharist. This issue, seemingly trivial, was packed with symbolic dynamite. For the Greeks, using unleavened bread was a Judaizing practice, a rejection of the leaven of the gospel which represented the new life in Christ. For the Latins, it was the practice of Christ himself at the Last Supper. The argument over bread was an argument over who was the true heir to the apostolic tradition. It was a proxy war for a much deeper conflict. The air in Constantinople grew thick with suspicion and hostility. The emperor's attempts to mediate failed. Humbert, feeling his authority flouted and his mission a failure, decided on a final dramatic act of defiance. On the afternoon of Saturday, July 16, 1054, as the clergy in the great cathedral of Hagia Sophia were preparing for the evening liturgy, Cardinal Humbert and the other legates strode into the church. They walked directly to the high altar, the sacred heart of the Orthodox world. In full view of the assembled clergy and people, Humbert placed a papal bull, a formal decree, upon the altar. The document was a bull of excommunication. It was not directed against the entire Eastern Church, but specifically against Patriarch Michael Cerularius and his supporters. Its language was venomous. It accused Cerularius of unspeakable crimes, of being a neophyte who bought his office, and condemned him and all who followed him. Having delivered their verdict, the legates turned, walked out of the cathedral, and symbolically shook the dust from their feet. An eyewitness reported that as they left, one of them declared, "Let God see and judge." A deacon ran after them, begging them to take back the bull. They refused. The bull was dropped in the street. This was not a schism. It was a piece of shocking, unprecedented political theatre, a gauntlet thrown down in the most sacred space of the Eastern Empire. What would you have done in the Patriarch's place? Ignored the insult as the act of an arrogant man, preserving the chance for peace, or responded with equal force to defend the honor of your church? Share your choice in the comments. The bull of excommunication left on the altar of Hagia Sophia was a spark thrown into a powder keg. The city of Constantinople erupted in riots. The populace, already suspicious of the Latins, was now incensed by this public desecration of their holiest shrine. Patriarch Michael Cerularius, who had perhaps provoked the crisis with his intransigence, now rode a wave of popular fury. He convened a synod of his bishops and on July 24th Just 8 days after Humbert's act, he issued a formal condemnation of the papal legates. The synod excommunicated Humbert and his companions, carefully avoiding a direct condemnation of the Pope himself, whose death was now known for certain. The anathemas were now mutual, but it is crucial to understand what had and had not happened. Two groups of churchmen had excommunicated each other. There was no formal declaration of schism between the Roman and Constantinopolitan churches. In the centuries that followed, communication and even intercommunion continued sporadically. To most ordinary Christians in both East and West, the events of 1054 were a distant squabble between ambitious clerics. They could not know that this personal dispute would, in retrospect, be seen as the point of no return. The true poison entered the relationship not through the ink of anathemas, but through the blood shed in the name of God. Less than 50 years after the drama in Hagia Sophia, a new movement seized the imagination of Western Europe, the Crusades. In the year 1095, the Byzantine Emperor Alexios Komnenos, facing the relentless advance of the Seljuk Turks who had conquered most of Anatolia, sent envoys to Pope Urban II. His request was modest. He needed skilled mercenary knights from the West to help him push back the Turks. What he got was something he could never have imagined. Pope Urban, a brilliant politician and a product of the Gregorian reform, saw a golden opportunity. He could channel the destructive violence of Europe's knights outward, heal the rift with the East by coming to its aid, and assert papal leadership over the entire Christian world. At the Council of Clermont, he delivered a sermon of such power that it set Europe ablaze. He called not for a mercenary expedition, but for a holy war, an armed pilgrimage to liberate the Holy Sepulchre in Jerusalem from Muslim rule. Tens of thousands, from princes to peasants, answered the call, sewing red crosses on their tunics. The First Crusade was a strange and volatile mix of genuine piety, landless ambition, and brutal greed. As these massive, undisciplined armies marched east, they were a culture shock to the sophisticated, orderly world of Byzantium. The emperor had asked for a small, professional army to place under his command. He received an uncontrollable human torrent. The Byzantines, with their gilded bureaucracy and courtly etiquette, saw the Crusaders as unwashed, illiterate, and dangerously unpredictable barbarians. The Crusaders, rough-hewn warriors from a feudal society, saw the Byzantines as devious, effeminate, and untrustworthy Greeks, more interested in diplomacy and intrigue than in fighting for the faith. The relationship was fraught with misunderstanding from the start. Emperor Alexios demanded that the Crusader leaders swear an oath of fealty to him, promising to return any formerly Byzantine lands they reconquered. The Western princes, who had come to carve out kingdoms for themselves, agreed with reluctance and, in many cases, with no intention of honoring their promise. Every step of the crusade became a source of friction. When the Crusaders, with Byzantine help, captured the city of Nicaea, the emperor negotiated its surrender without allowing the Westerners to plunder it, a standard practice of their form of warfare. The Crusaders felt cheated. Later, at the grueling siege of Antioch, the Byzantine contingent withdrew, believing the cause was lost. When the Crusaders, against all odds, took the city, their leader Bohemond refused to return it to the emperor, claiming Alexios had broken his end of the bargain. He established his own Latin Principality of Antioch, a dagger in the side of the Byzantine Empire. They came to save their brother's land, but they ended up wanting the land more than the brothers. As the Crusaders marched south, they established a chain of Latin states, the County of Edessa, the Principality of Antioch, the Kingdom of Jerusalem, imposing a Latin hierarchy on a predominantly Orthodox Christian population. These states were colonial outposts, a permanent Western military and ecclesiastical presence in the heart of the East. The aid had turned into an occupation. The Holy War, meant to unite Christendom, had created a new, bleeding frontier of resentment right through its middle. The schism was no longer an abstract theological dispute. It was now the lived reality of political and military conflict. The common crusader, often ignorant of the finer points of the Filioque, now had a simple, visceral reason to distrust the Greeks. He saw them as treacherous allies who would rather scheme than fight. The ordinary Byzantine citizen, who may not have cared about the powers of the Pope, now saw the Franks, as they called all Westerners, as violent invaders who stole their land and desecrated their churches. The religious differences were now used to justify political and military actions. The Greeks were heretics, so it was acceptable to break an oath sworn to them. The Latins were barbarians, so it was acceptable to withhold support from them. The alliance forged by Pope Urban's grand vision was unraveling into a quagmire of mutual contempt. The chasm dug by theologians was now being widened by soldiers, and it was about to be filled with a river of Christian blood. The stage was set for the ultimate betrayal, an act so monstrous it would make the events of 1054 seem like a polite disagreement. If the First Crusade had poisoned the relationship between East and West, the Fourth Crusade slit its throat. The story of what happened in the year 1204 is one of the most shameful episodes in European history, a perfect storm of greed, political intrigue, and religious fanaticism. It began, like the others, with a call from a Pope, Innocent III, to launch a new expedition to liberate Jerusalem. The plan was to sail directly to Egypt, the heart of Muslim power. A mighty army of French knights gathered in Venice to contract for passage. And here, the tragedy began to take shape. The Crusaders could not pay the exorbitant fee demanded by the Venetians for their fleet. They were trapped in debt, and their grand holy war was on the verge of collapse before it had even begun. But the Doge of Venice, Enrico Dandolo, a man in his 90s, blind but possessed of a cunning and ruthless political mind, offered them a deal. He would defer their debt if they would help Venice recapture the rebellious Christian city of Zara on the Adriatic coast. The Crusaders, desperate and with little choice, agreed. For the first time, a crusading army turned its weapons against a fellow Christian city. The Pope was horrified and excommunicated the entire crusade. The Rubicon had been crossed. While the Crusaders were wintering in Zara, a new temptation arrived. A young Byzantine prince, Alexios Angelos, appeared in their camp. His father had been deposed and blinded, and he offered the Crusaders an irresistible deal. If they would sail to Constantinople and restore him to the throne, he would pay off their entire debt to Venice, finance their crusade to the Holy Land, and, most importantly, submit the entire Orthodox Church to the authority of the Pope in Rome. It was the ultimate prize. For the Venetians, it was a chance to crush their main commercial rival. For the Crusader leaders, it was a way out of their financial ruin and a chance to achieve the century-old dream of healing the schism, albeit by force. The pious rank and file were told this was a just cause to restore a rightful ruler and end the Greek heresy. The crusade was diverted. Its new target was not Jerusalem, but the greatest Christian city in the world, Constantinople. In the summer of 1203, the massive Crusader fleet appeared before the walls of Constantinople. The Byzantines were stunned. The city fell with relative ease, and the young Alexios was placed on the throne alongside his blinded father. But the fantasy quickly unraveled. The new emperor could not pay the vast sum he had promised. The city's treasury was empty, and his attempts to raise the money by melting down icons and imposing heavy taxes turned the population against him and his Latin patrons. The atmosphere in the city grew toxic. Brawls between Greeks and Latins became common. In early 1204, a popular uprising overthrew the puppet emperor, who was murdered. A new anti-Latin emperor was acclaimed. For the Crusaders, this was the final betrayal. Their promised payment was gone, they were stranded in a hostile land, and they were convinced the Greeks would never honor any deal. They decided to take their payment by force. They would conquer the city for themselves. What followed was 3 days of horror. On April 12, 1204, the Crusaders breached the city's massive sea walls and poured into Constantinople. They had been promised absolution for their sins. Now they unleashed them. They slaughtered indiscriminately men, women, and children. They looted with a savagery that shocked even their own chroniclers. Nothing was sacred. Churches were stripped bare. The great altar of Hagia Sophia, made of solid gold and precious jewels, was smashed to pieces and divided among the soldiers. A prostitute was placed on the patriarch's throne, singing lewd songs. Priceless ancient statues, relics of the classical world, were melted down for coin. The great library of Constantinople was put to the torch. Relics, the bones of saints, pieces of the true cross, were stolen and shipped back to churches and monasteries in France, Germany, and Italy, a spiritual plunder that accompanied the material one. One Crusader knight wrote, "Since the world was created, never had so much booty been won in any city." It was for the West a tragic, but ultimately profitable excess. For the East, it was the apocalypse. The sack of Constantinople was the point of no return. It was an act of civilizational fratricide. The Crusaders established a Latin empire on the ruins of Byzantium, which lasted for just over 50 years. A Venetian was installed as the Patriarch of Constantinople. The schism was no longer a matter for theologians. It was a fact of life, written in blood and fire, seared into the collective memory of the Orthodox people. How could they ever contemplate reunion with those who had murdered their people, desecrated their sanctuaries, and destroyed their city? The word Latin became synonymous with barbarian, thief, and heretic. Any lingering sense of a shared Christian identity was extinguished in the flames of Constantinople. The events of 1054 had been a disagreement between clergymen. The events of 1204 were a crime committed against an entire people. The wound, which had been festering for centuries, was now a gaping, unhealable chasm filled with the ghosts of a betrayed city. Though the Byzantines eventually recaptured their capital in 1261, the empire was a shadow of its former self, broken and impoverished, a small Greek state surrounded by powerful enemies. The gravest threat now came from the east, from the inexorable advance of the Ottoman Turks. For the next 2 centuries, the dying empire fought for its survival. In their desperation, a succession of Byzantine emperors turned once again to the west, to the Pope, for military aid. But the price of that aid remained the same as it was for the Fourth Crusaders: submission to Rome. This led to 2 last, tragic attempts to heal the schism through political means, at the Councils of Lyon in 1274 and Ferrara-Florence in 1439. These were not theological dialogues between equals. They were negotiations held at sword point, with the survival of an empire hanging in the balance. The Council of Lyon was driven by Emperor Michael VIII Palaiologos, the man who had recaptured Constantinople from the Latins. His motives were purely political. He desperately needed to prevent the powerful Western king, Charles of Anjou, from launching a new crusade to restore the Latin Empire. By agreeing to a union with the Pope, he could gain a powerful ally and neutralize his greatest enemy. He sent a delegation to Lyon, which duly accepted all of Rome's terms: the primacy of the Pope, the right of appeal to Rome, and even the recitation of the Creed with the Filioque. In the West, there was great celebration. The schism was officially over. But in the East, the union was dead on arrival. The clergy and people were outraged. They saw the emperor's actions as a complete betrayal of the Orthodox faith. The emperor had to resort to a brutal campaign of persecution, imprisoning, torturing, and blinding opponents of the union to enforce his policy. The Union of Lyon was never a spiritual reality. It was a personal policy of the emperor, imposed by force, which died with him. A century and a half later, the situation was even more desperate. The Ottoman Turks had conquered almost all of Byzantine territory. The emperor in Constantinople ruled little more than the city itself. In a final desperate gamble, Emperor John VIII Palaiologos traveled to Italy himself, along with his patriarch and a large delegation of bishops and scholars to attend the Council of Ferrara, which later moved to Florence. The negotiations lasted for 2 agonizing years. The Greeks were housed at the Pope's expense, treated as honored guests, but they were also financial prisoners. The theological debates were long and sophisticated. The Latins pressed their case on the Filioque and papal primacy. The Greeks, led by scholars like Mark of Ephesus, fiercely defended the orthodox position. But political reality loomed over every debate. The emperor knew that without Western military aid, his city was doomed. Under immense pressure, the Greek delegation, with the heroic exception of Mark of Ephesus, finally capitulated. In July of 1439, a decree of union was solemnly proclaimed in the great cathedral of Florence. On paper, the church was one again. But this paper union was as stillborn as the one at Lyon. When the Greek delegates returned to Constantinople, they were met not with praise, but with scorn and contempt. They were treated as traitors and apostates. The people refused to pray in churches where the union was commemorated. The clergy who supported it were ostracized. The phrase that came to embody the popular sentiment was stark and terrifying: better the Turkish turban than the papal tiara. For the people of Byzantium, the memory of the Fourth Crusade was still fresh. They preferred submission to a Muslim conqueror who would at least allow them to keep their orthodox faith, to union with the hated Latins, which they saw as a spiritual annihilation. The choice was between physical death and spiritual death, and they chose the former. The Union of Florence, the most sophisticated attempt at reconciliation, had failed utterly. It saved no one and only proved that a unity forged by political desperation, rather than a true meeting of hearts and minds, is no unity at all. It was the empire's last breath, exhaled in a prayer for help, that was answered with a demand for its soul. Faced with the end of your civilization, would you sacrifice your deepest held beliefs for a slim chance of survival, or would you maintain your principles and accept your fate? Let us know what you would choose. The Western aid promised at Florence never arrived in sufficient force. A small crusading army was crushed by the Ottomans a few years later. The great powers of Europe were too preoccupied with their own wars and rivalries to mount a serious defense of the dying city. The end came in the spring of 1453. The new Sultan, Mehmed II, a brilliant and ambitious young ruler, assembled a massive army and a fleet armed with powerful new cannons to besiege Constantinople. The city, with its dwindling population and crumbling walls, was defended by a small, heroic force of about 7,000 men, including a contingent of Genoese volunteers. The last Byzantine emperor, Constantine XI Palaiologos, fought and died on the walls alongside his soldiers. On May 29, 1453, after a 53-day siege, the city fell. The 1,000-year-old Christian Roman Empire was no more. Mehmed the Conqueror rode his horse into the cathedral of Hagia Sophia, the jewel of Christendom, and ordered it to be converted into a mosque. The fall of Constantinople was a world-changing event. It sent a shockwave across Europe, but it also cemented the Great Schism as a permanent geopolitical reality. The leading center of Orthodox Christianity was now under Islamic rule. The institutional structure of the Church was broken. For the West, it was a tragedy, but also, in a strange way, a boon. Thousands of Greek scholars fled the fallen city, carrying with them precious manuscripts of classical and Byzantine learning. They settled in Italy and other parts of Europe, helping to fuel the intellectual fire of the Renaissance. The West, which had in part contributed to Byzantium's downfall, now reaped the cultural rewards of its collapse. The end of one world became the dawn of a new age for another, a bitter irony in a story already filled with them. With Constantinople, the second Rome, fallen, the Orthodox world looked for a new center, a new protector. And it found one in the rising power of the North, the Grand Duchy of Moscow. Russian churchmen and rulers began to articulate a powerful new idea. The first Rome had fallen into heresy because of its pact with the Latins. The second Rome, Constantinople, had fallen to the Turks as punishment for its own flirtation with a union at Florence. Now Moscow was the third Rome. The Russian state was the last independent Orthodox power on earth, the heir to the legacy of both Rome and Constantinople. This potent ideology fused Orthodox faith with Russian national identity and imperial ambition. The schism was no longer just a theological dispute between Greeks and Latins. It was now embedded in the civilizational DNA of a new empire. The Russian rulers saw themselves as the defenders of the true faith against a heretical Catholic West and a Muslim East. The divide was no longer a line on a map. It was the foundation of a new world order. The Ottoman conquest had another profound effect. It froze the Orthodox Church in time. Under Muslim rule, the Orthodox communities, known as the Rum Millet, were allowed a degree of self-governance, but theological innovation was impossible. The Church's primary role became one of preservation, to maintain the faith, the language, and the culture of the conquered people. While the West was about to be torn apart by the explosive forces of the Renaissance, the Reformation, and the Enlightenment, the East entered a long period of cultural and intellectual slumber, guarding the ancient traditions against all change. The paths of the two halves of Christendom, which had been diverging for 1,000 years, now split completely. One was rocketing toward modernity, the other was encased in the amber of tradition. The tragedy was complete. The brothers were not even living in the same century anymore. The schism, now a millennium old, had become more than a religious divide. It had carved two different paths for the development of European civilization, creating two distinct cultural and political worlds that continue to exist to this day. The histories of Western and Eastern Europe in the centuries after the fall of Constantinople are the stories of this divergence. The West, having centralized immense spiritual and temporal power in the Papacy, then embarked on a long and violent rebellion against that very power. The Protestant Reformation of the 16th century was a direct, explosive rejection of papal authority, a declaration of independence by the northern half of Europe. In a sense, Martin Luther was completing the protest that Patriarch Photius had started centuries earlier. The very concept of a monolithic, centralized church was shattered. This religious revolution, in turn, paved the way for political and intellectual revolutions. The rise of nation-states, the scientific revolution, the Enlightenment, and the age of secularism were all, in part, consequences of this Western trajectory of questioning and ultimately overthrowing absolute authority. The East followed a completely different path. The Orthodox peoples living under the Ottoman yoke had a different struggle, not for intellectual freedom, but for physical and cultural survival. The Church became the primary vessel of national identity, preserving language, traditions, and a sense of community in the absence of a state. In Russia, the Third Rome, a different model emerged. The concept of symphony, the harmonious cooperation of church and state that had been the Byzantine ideal, was reborn in a new, more autocratic form. The Tsar was the protector of orthodoxy, and the Church was a key pillar of his imperial power. There was no reformation, no widespread challenge to religious authority. Instead of revolution, the ideal was stability. Instead of individualism, the ideal was communality or sobornost. The East looked upon the West with deep suspicion, seeing its intellectual ferment as a descent into chaos, atheism, and spiritual decay. The West, in turn, often looked at the East as backward, stagnant, and despotic. These two divergent paths created two different Europes. They developed different legal systems, with the West building on Roman law and the East on Byzantine and customary law. They developed different political philosophies, with the West championing concepts of natural rights and social contracts, while the East emphasized duty, sacrifice, and the collective good. Even their art and music evolved differently. It was a 1,000-year Cold War of the soul, which periodically erupted into hot wars, from the Napoleonic invasion of Russia to the ideological struggle of the 20th century. The Iron Curtain did not appear out of nowhere in 1945. It fell along a very old civilizational fault line, a line that had been drawn in 1054. One brother went to conquer the world and, in the eyes of the other, lost his soul in the process. The other tried to save his soul and, in the eyes of the other, lost the world. This deep-seated mistrust, born of centuries of conflict and misunderstanding, shaped the modern world in ways we are only now beginning to comprehend. It influenced the borders of nations, the alliances of empires, and the very mentality of peoples on both sides of the divide. Could you sacrifice truth for the sake of unity? It is a question that the leaders on both sides faced repeatedly. and repeatedly they chose what they believed to be truth, and in doing so they shattered unity. The schism is not just a piece of medieval history. It is a living legacy, a story of how cultural arrogance, political ambition, and the lust for absolute power can take a shared faith and turn it into a weapon of division. It is a cautionary tale about the danger of certainty, the belief that our way of seeing God is the only way, and that our brothers, who see him differently, must be not just wrong, but enemies. The consequences of that certainty have echoed for 1,000 years, and their sound has not faded yet. For 900 years, the anathemas of 1054 remained in place, a formal symbol of a division that had long since become a hardened reality. But in the 20th century, amidst the rubble of 2 world wars and the rise of new global threats, something began to change. A new spirit of ecumenism, a desire for Christian unity, began to stir. The catalyst was a series of remarkable encounters between 2 extraordinary men, Pope Paul VI and the ecumenical patriarch of Constantinople, Athenagoras. Their first meeting in Jerusalem in 1964 was the first time a pope and a patriarch of Constantinople had met in over 500 years, since the ill-fated Council of Florence. This dialogue of love, as they called it, was a revolutionary act, a conscious decision to overcome centuries of bitterness and see the brother, not the heretic, in the other. This new spirit culminated in a historic and deeply moving event on December 7, 1965. On the same day, in ceremonies in Rome and in Istanbul, Pope Paul VI and Patriarch Athenagoras formally lifted the mutual excommunications of 1054. The declarations they issued were profound. They stated that the anathemas were directed against persons, not churches, and that they should be removed from memory and from the midst of the church. It was a grand gesture of reconciliation, a moment of incredible hope. It seemed as if the wound that had bled for 9 centuries might finally begin to heal. The doors that had been slammed shut were creaked open. A new era of dialogue, respect, and cooperation began. But can 1,000 years of divergent history be undone by a single document? The lifting of the anathemas was a crucial first step, but it was only that. It removed the formal barrier of condemnation, but it could not erase the deep theological and historical obstacles that remained. The dialogue of love had been successful, but the dialogue of truth proved far more difficult. The fundamental issues that caused the schism in the first place are still unresolved. The Filioque clause remains in the Latin Creed. The Catholic Church continues to uphold the doctrine of papal primacy and infallibility, a concept that remains the single greatest obstacle to reunion from the Orthodox perspective. For the Orthodox, the Pope can be the first among equals, a position of honor, but never a supreme ruler with universal jurisdiction over the Church. This is not a matter of politics, it is a matter of ecclesiology, of the very definition of what the Church is. Furthermore, the scar tissue of history is thick and painful. While theologians can debate the nature of the Trinity, the popular memory in many Orthodox lands is still shaped by the trauma of the Crusades, especially the sack of Constantinople in 1204. The forced unions of Lyon and Florence are remembered not as attempts at reconciliation, but as acts of spiritual violence. More recent events, such as the creation of the Eastern Catholic churches, churches that follow Orthodox rites but are in communion with Rome, are seen by many Orthodox as a form of sheep stealing, a uniate model that undermines true dialogue. The wound has stopped bleeding, but the scar remains, sensitive to the touch. What is more terrifying, an enemy who wants to kill you, or a brother who is certain he is saving your soul by forcing you to become like him? The Great Schism is the story of a tragedy. It is a tragedy of pride of 2 great centers of Christianity, Rome and Constantinople, each convinced of its own righteousness, each unable to listen to the other. Rome demanded submission, while Constantinople demanded respect. At this Vanity Fair, peace turned out to be too cheap a commodity. The schism teaches us that great divisions rarely begin with a single dramatic act. They are the result of a long, slow drift of countless small failures of love, humility, and understanding. They are born when we allow our cultural, political, and personal ambitions to become intertwined with our faith, turning a message of universal love into a banner for tribal identity. Today, the dialogue continues. The relationship between the Catholic and Orthodox churches is warmer and more fraternal than at any time in the last millennium, but they remain two separate lungs in what was once a single body. The world has changed. New empires rise and fall. New ideologies demand our allegiance, and the central question raised by this thousand-year tragedy remains as urgent as ever. 1,000 years ago, pride and a lust for power split a united world. Today, in an era of new empires and information wars, the principles have not changed. Tell us what, in your opinion, is more dangerous for the future: fanatic faith in one's own exclusive rightness, or cynical calculation, ready to sacrifice any truth for the sake of power? Write your answer in the comments. Your perspective is crucial.